Philosophy and Religious Studies here at the University of Macau. Today, we are joined by Dr. Drew Johnson in a virtual capacity. He is speaking to us presently from the United States in a wildly different time zone, quite early from his side. So we are extra appreciative of that. I know it's not exactly an ideal time to be presenting heavy duty philosophical ideas, but really we do appreciate that extra bit of sacrifice on your part. Drew, Dr. Johnson is a philosopher affiliated with the Good Attention Research Project at the University of Oslo in Norway. He's the author of numerous articles published in venues such as the Asian Journal of Philosophy, Erkenntnis, Episteme, Thought, and others. He also has a book contract with Palgrave Macmillan, and he'll be talking to you today about the contents of that book. In general, he is a specialized philosopher in epistemology, philosophy of mind, and metaethics, having done a doctoral thesis at the University of Connecticut touching on issues in all of those areas, and also has ongoing research interests in topics such as the functions of attention, the epistemology of self-knowledge, teleosemantic theories of mental content, and others. The title of Dr. Johnson's talk today is The Problems of Certainty in Public Life. Before I pass things over, as always, I would love it if you all offered a warm welcome in the form of some applause. Okay, I yield my time.
Okay. Thank you, Ben. I've known Ben for some time now, and I really appreciate the invitation to speak here. Okay. Hello, everybody. Daga hao. I attempt. Um, yes. So today I'm going to talk about the problems of certainty in public life. And this presentation is based on work that I'm doing for my book, titled "Belief Beyond Reason." Um, which is still in early stages. So I appreciate having you all as an audience. I'm hoping to get some useful feedback as I'm developing these ideas further. So what I'm going to do in part one is discuss the project in a general way and describe some of the motivation behind the project. In part two, I'm going to present my own sort of approach to hinge epistemology, which I will say a lot more about that shortly. And then in part three, I'm going to apply that approach to the problems of certainty in public life. And in particular, I want to try to say something about deep disagreement. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and try to zoom in here. So my starting point is to identify what I think is an ambivalence about certainty, or some conflicting attitudes that we have with regard to the value of certainty in particular. And so I see this ambivalence arising in two different ways. Within philosophy, I think there is something like this ambivalence concerning skepticism. And so here I have in mind radical skeptical arguments that aim to show that we cannot have the knowledge of the world around us in the way that we typically think we can. And so these radical skeptical arguments, of course, they challenge our claims to knowledge, and in so doing, they challenge the things that we think are certain. And the sort of ambivalence I see here is that on the one hand, these arguments are important. They contain some good insights. And because of that, they encourage some intellectual humility. They lead us to maybe question whether we do know the things we think we know. But on the other hand, I think there can be a reaction to these arguments where they seem unsettling, precisely because they challenge so much of what we take for granted and our basic way of relating to reality. And I think also that the radical skepticism maybe is not a position that one can really truly adopt, or it's very hard to do so. And so I think this encourages a kind of tension, where on the one hand, we want to acknowledge the way that these arguments can be humbling, but we also want to hold on to the idea that we can have some basic knowledge about the world. I'm not going to talk about skepticism today, although I will talk about it in the book. Today, I want to discuss the topic of public life, or ambivalence about certainty in public life. And here, I think when somebody is extremely certain about something, that can start to cause some problems in public discourse, because that person starts to be less, well, they seem like they're less reasonable when we try to talk to them about a political or moral issue. So this is to say that dogmatism, or being intellectually arrogant, or being closed-minded, those all seem to evolve in excess of certainty, and that seems like a problem when we want to talk to each other about policy decisions, for instance. Nevertheless, I think less frequently talked about is the possibility that certainty can have some value in public life, in the form of intellectual resilience or intellectual strength, and an independence, for instance, against manipulation. So, if somebody tries to convince you that a groundless conspiracy theory is true, it could be valuable for you to be certain of certain things, because that can kind of protect you against being influenced by these groundless theories. And so part of what I want to do in this project is explore how we can address maybe some problems of certainty while still acknowledging its value. And so in order to make this more concrete in the case of public discourse, I just want to talk about an example and give a couple of variations of that example, which will kind of set the stage for the discussion of deep disagreement later. So here I just want to run through this case. I will definitely need to zoom in for this. So the case that I'm discussing here, let's say we're talking about two people, Alex and Billy, and suppose that Alex is a deeply religious Christian, and his views on a variety of topics are influenced by that perspective. So for example, Alex may believe that God implants a soul at the moment of conception, and that belief leads Alex to have a pro-life stance on the topic of abortion. And so he thinks that most abortions are wrong. Billy, by contrast, let's suppose, is an atheist, and she believes that moral questions should be resolved without using religious values. And maybe she defends a pro-choice position about abortion, which is informed by her feminist perspective. I'm supposing, for the sake of this argument, that Alex and Billy are they regard each other as intelligent and reasonable, but when it comes to the topic of abortion, neither accepts the reasons offered by the other. They've held lengthy discussions on the topic, but the disagreement persists. And eventually they decide to stop talking about it in order to preserve their good relationship. So I'm intending this to be an instance of what you can call deep disagreement. And I suspect that all of you maybe have some other examples in mind, so you can use whatever example you prefer that makes this the clearest to you. I don't think this is a very unusual phenomenon. But it raises some questions for us. So we might wonder how it is possible for Alex or Billy to come to an agreement rationally, or whether Alex or Billy should decrease their certainty because they know that they disagree, right? Alex might think, maybe Billy knows something that I don't, and so I should be less certain. So these are common questions in the epistemology of disagreement in general. And I just want to focus on a couple of variations to narrow in the focus a little bit more. So we can consider one variant that occurs in online discourse. So it will be the same as before, except that Alex and Billy are not workplace colleagues, but they're active members online where discussions about topics of political and public interest are held. And so they're each influential members of groups who pay attention to the arguments that they make. And so their arguments have more influence beyond just their own conversation. As an alternative, we can consider this legislative variant, where we imagine that Alex and Billy are elected members of a legislative body, and so they may need to debate and come to a decision about proposed legislation concerning abortion. And in this case, I think we could expect that whatever decision they reach should be informed by good reasons, right? That they should come to that conclusion with good justification. And so I think this gives us some further questions that I'm more interested in, such as whether a rational resolution is possible across polarized groups or groups with increasingly different positions. And then also whether the legitimacy, say, of a political decision by policymakers, whether that requires a rational resolution of disagreement among those policymakers in order for them to have a common justification to give for that decision. Okay, so these are some of the questions that are interesting me in the vein of public discourse, and I hope to return to them by the end of this presentation to show how the view I want to develop can provide some guidance here. Just to briefly now zoom out and give an overview of the overall book project. What I aim to do in this project is to explore the concept of certainty in terms of hinge epistemology, which I will say more about in a moment. The central aims are to develop a novel approach within hinge epistemology, which I call perspectival hinge epistemology, or PHE. Secondly, I want to apply PHE to problems of certainty in public life. And for the purposes of this presentation, I'm just going to focus on how we can explain deep disagreement, such as the disagreement between Alex and Billy, in terms of a conflict in core certainties. And then finally, I want to explore how people should relate to their own certainties. So when you think of the things that you are personally most certain of in life, how should you relate to those things? Is it okay to be completely certain? What does it look like, maybe, to have some humility about your most firmly held beliefs? Okay, so I'm now going to begin discussing the view that I want to develop and defend in this book, and then apply to the problems of certainty. So first, I'm not going to assume any background in hinge epistemology. So I do want to say a little bit to introduce this idea. So hinge epistemology is an approach in epistemology that's based on Ludwig Wittgenstein's text on certainty, especially his idea that the questions that we raise and our doubts depend upon the fact that some propositions are exempt from doubt, as it were like the hinges on which those turn. So just as a door to turn, the hinges have to stay put. The idea here is that you have certain beliefs or certain propositions that have to stay put or fixed in order for you to be able to believe something at all, or to be able to doubt something at all. Now, there are many different readings of hinge epistemology, but they all share in at least the following two claims. They all share in this claim of a lack of evidential support. So they say that certain commitments, we can call them hinges, are central to epistemology, to us forming beliefs and having doubts, but they lack evidential support, or they lack support by reasons in some sense. That is, you couldn't provide a genuine reason that explains why you have that commitment. Nevertheless, the thought is those commitments are legitimate to hold, right? So it's okay to have these kinds of commitments, even though you lack a rational basis for them. Overall, these hinges are held to play a special role in epistemic practice, and because of this role, they're immune to certain kinds of doubts. So they're protected against skeptical doubts. And so this is one of the main points of discussion in the literature, showing how this gives us a way of addressing radical skepticism. Okay. At the same time, however, these hinges are not, it's not a foundationalist picture in the sense that the hinges are not, they're not foundations, right? They're not things which are absolutely certain and completely well justified, right? Although they are certain, the ideas, they're not well justified. Okay. I want to introduce a little bit of the literature on hinge epistemology, because this is what I will contrast my own view against. So that's how I will explain my own view. There are 4 central accounts that I'll talk about, which each differ a little bit in what they say a hinge commitment exactly is. So Danielle Moyle-Sharrock advances a non-propositional reading, which says that really hinges, these are things that are neither true nor false. Instead, they're rules embodied in our ways of life. So to use Wittgenstein's central example, I could talk about my commitment to the proposition that I have 2 hands, right? This is something that is very certain to me, that I have hands. And Moyle-Sharrock might say that, well, that's actually really what we're talking about here is not something that's true or false, but it's just my way of life. So that commitment is embodied in the way in which I can reach for a cup with my hand without any hesitation, right? I don't wonder at all about whether my hand exists. Duncan Pritchard advances what he calls a non-belief reading, which says that hinges, they are propositional. They can be true or false, but they aren't things that we believe. We don't really believe them. And the reason we don't believe them is he thinks that the relevant kind of belief is something which has to be sensitive to reasons. It has to be the kind of thing that could be supported by reasons. And because hinges can't be supported by reasons, he says they couldn't really be beliefs. Anna-Lisa Kaliva has another option where she says that hinges are acceptances. Similarly to Pritchard, these are supposed to be things which are like belief, but aren't exactly belief, right? So it's an attitude that's not justified, but it is a presupposition. It's something we have to accept in order to apply basic epistemic methods. And then finally, Crispin Wright advances a similar view, the entitlement reading, which sees hinges as entitlements. So they are things that you epistemically are warranted to have. So this is something like a kind of justification, but they're not based in evidence, really. Okay. Overall, these hinges are often said to determine what can count as evidence for what. And because of this, they're not subject to evaluation in terms of evidence themselves. And so on the one hand, hinges are maximally certain. So they're completely certain to you. And so any attempt to doubt them, so anything you might say to doubt the hinge, will be less certain to you than the hinge itself. And for that reason, it can't succeed in really calling the hinge into doubt. Likewise, because any evidence you might give for a hinge is also less certain than the hinge, that evidence cannot really play a supporting role. And so this helps to explain why they might be evidentially unsupported. So again, if I say, I'm certain that I have 2 hands, you might say, oh, well, of course you can provide some evidential support for that. You can see that you have your hands in front of you. And so you might think my perception is a basis for that belief. The reply to this that we find in Wittgenstein is to say, well, are you really more certain that your perception is functioning properly than you are that you have 2 hands in the first place? His point is that these 2 ideas, that I have hands and that my perception is functioning properly, are maybe on a par in terms of how certain they are, or at least it's not the case that you are more certain of your perception than that you have hands. And because of that, he says, your perception doesn't really provide a basis for the certainty that you have hands, because there isn't this kind of grounding relationship between them. Okay. Now, I haven't said anything about what might be an example of a hinge, except for the claim maybe that I have two hands. There's a reason I haven't really given an example yet, and that is that even within the literature, there is disagreement about what counts as a hinge. So there's not a lot of agreement about what a good example is. A general theme, however, is that many proponents argue that hinges should be something that is abstract and general. So Annalisa Kliva, for instance, argues that hinges are abstract, general, empirical propositions, such as the claim that there is an external world. Right? It's very general, quite abstract. Michael Lynch similarly talks about epistemic methods and norms. So he talks about observation, induction, inference. Crispin Wright, again, very similarly, talks about presuppositions for gaining justification in a topic. So, for instance, if I want to have a belief that somebody maybe is thinking something right now, I would first have to accept that there are minds besides my own. So that would be a general hinge for that kind of belief. And then finally, Duncan Pritchard actually, in his considered view, says that there's really only one hinge. It's the hinge we all have, we all share it, to the proposition that you are not radically and fundamentally deceived in your believing. So it's a kind of general hinge in the correctness of your own basic worldview. However, he says that this abstract hinge can be codified or embodied in many different personal hinges. The reason I want to bring this up is that if we look at the examples we get from Wittgenstein, I think we get a bit of a different picture. And so, of course, these other theorists are not exactly trying to just interpret Wittgenstein. They're also giving their own development of his views. And I will do that as well. But I think if we look at some of the original examples in Wittgenstein, it points the way to an alternative picture of hinge epistemology. So Wittgenstein uses a varied stock of examples, including the claims that houses don't suddenly turn into steam, or that my friend doesn't have sawdust in his head, and even that nobody has ever been to the moon and it is impossible to climb or fly there, which today we would say is false. And so looking at the variability in these examples, I think we need a model for hinge commitments that can accommodate that variability while also explaining what they have in common. And so following some recent work by Duncan Pritchard, I think we can do this when we see these three characteristics as features of our most certain core commitments. First, that the certainty should be fundamental, which means that if you were to have a doubt about the certainty, that would undermine much of the rest of your knowledge. So it would plunge the rest of your worldview into chaos. So I'm certain that I have two hands, but if I somehow learned that were wrong right now, that would undermine a lot of the rest of my knowledge, right? I might then come to seriously doubt any kind of medical examination or what I hear from doctors, right? Thinking, oh, I've gone all my life thinking that I have hands, and yet maybe I've been hallucinating that. Why hasn't anyone told me about that before? These commitments should also be obvious to the individual, and they should also be visceral in the sense that they are really rooted in action rather than reasons. And so this is acknowledging something correct in Daniel Boyle-Chirac's view that, right, really why I hold the certainty that I have two hands is not because I've been convinced by that in terms of reasons. Nobody's presented an argument to me to show that I have hands. Rather, it's rooted in my basic ways of acting, right? My lack of hesitation when I want to reach for a cup, for instance. Now, with these characteristics of hinges, I think this allows for a wider range in contents than certain other approaches might allow. So for instance, given these characteristics, I think we could identify some moral certainties, such as that it would be wrong to pour gasoline on a cat and ignite it just for fun, right? So that is something that I think many of us hold as a sort of basic certainty. Now, you might wonder why there has been a tendency to speak about completely general hinges and not to look at these more specific ones. I think in the background here is a concern about epistemic relativism. So Wittgenstein's uncertainty, many people have acknowledged that it has relativist readings, but many people also argue that these are only superficial. And many of the proponents of hinge epistemology want to show that their readings are not relativist. And I think that leads them to downplay certain examples that are in Wittgenstein. The central move, of course, is to argue that there's less variation in our hinge commitments than would appear just from a superficial reading of the text. On the other hand, some others also advance a relativist reading and say that that's more consistent with what Wittgenstein himself says. Now, epistemic relativism is important for me to consider because I think it reemerges when we start to talk about problems in public discourse. So I want to define, what do I mean by epistemic relativism? So I think we can define epistemic relativism with the following claims. First, there's a dependence claim, which says that a belief has an epistemic status. It can be justified or unjustified, only relative to an epistemic system. Secondly, plurality, that there are more than one such system. And thirdly, incommensurability, which says that these distinct epistemic systems are incompatible with each other. And so what that kind of tells us is that it's possible for two people, say, to have two different epistemic systems. And one epistemic system might say that a certain proposition is true, while the other epistemic system says that that proposition is false. And so you could have this kind of disagreement between the epistemic systems. Nevertheless, if we're going to be true relativists, we should hold non-neutrality, which says that there is no way neutral, independent of a system to evaluate these different systems. So there's no way that you could say that one person's epistemic system is better than another person's epistemic system, unless you're already within a system to make that evaluation. Finally, relativism is also often associated with this equal validity claim, which says that all epistemic systems are equally valid or are on a par, right? So every person's epistemic system, if it's different, they all have equal validity. And epistemic relativism, importantly, I think it does encourage some intellectual humility, which I want to talk more about. But it's also a view that has some serious problems. Yeah, there are two problems I could talk about here, but I think I'm just going to focus on the second one, which specifically has to do with this equal validity idea. And the problem is that equal validity as a claim is self-undermining when it's part of epistemic relativism. This is because if you want to say that all epistemic systems are equally valid, that seems to be a way of saying that there is an epistemically neutral stance from which you can evaluate all epistemic systems. It's just that from that stance, all the systems come out equally valid. That is your evaluation, right? You're saying that they're all valid. But this idea that you could have such an epistemically neutral stance, of course, contradicts the non-neutrality claim of epistemic relativism. And so I don't think we have a really stable view here in the end. So this leads me to think that either we should say that equal validity is not really a component of epistemic relativism. I think Natalie Ashton argues something like this. But alternatively, you might just say that if it really is a component of epistemic relativism, then epistemic relativism is a problematic view. So what should we do? Well, where I want to go in the book, let me just get this aligned. Okay. Where I want to go in the book is to propose what I'm calling a perspectival approach, because I do want to preserve a lot of the epistemic relativist idea, precisely because I think that will allow us to explain deep disagreement, and it points the way to the value of intellectual humility. So I think there's some real value in the relativist idea. But the idea of taking the perspectivalist approach is also to distance myself a little bit from relativism, at least from the problematic parts of it. So as I'm defining it, the perspectival approach, it has to do with the perspective. It shares certain features with epistemic relativism. So it shares dependence, plurality, incommensurability, and non-neutrality. But it excludes the problematic equal validity claim. And in order to address certain concerns about skepticism that come with relativism, I think we should view the perspectival approach as including a commitment to saying that there is a common reality that is shared amongst everybody, but it's a reality on which we can have a plurality of perspectives. And it's part of the nature of a perspective, I think, that it is a partial and incomplete view on the world, and that those perspectives can sometimes come into conflict with each other. Okay. And so within this basic approach, it turns out that it is possible to evaluate epistemic systems. But when you do so, you're doing so already from within an epistemic system, namely your own epistemic perspective. Now in the book, I want to spend some time to develop the concept of an epistemic perspective. So what do I mean when I'm talking about an epistemic perspective? Here, I'm drawing from work by Elizabeth Camp and Ilga Umisek. So Camp, for instance, defines a perspective as an open-ended disposition to encounter, interpret, and respond to some parts of the world in certain ways. Okay, so you can think of it maybe as a kind of filter of how you approach the world or how you interpret the world. Building on this, I'm going to say that an epistemic perspective is an open-ended disposition to encounter, interpret, and respond to evidence in certain ways. That's what makes it an epistemic perspective. So an epistemic perspective is a way of responding to evidence in forming beliefs, in maintaining beliefs, and updating your beliefs. And so, yeah, the general idea here is that epistemic perspectives are going to be relatively stable across contexts, and they give us a general and unified way of seeking and engaging with evidence. And of course, right, my kind of idea here is that when we think about a plurality of epistemic perspectives, I want to hold that certain propositions can be essentially connected with an epistemic perspective as a component of it. And so the idea is that our hinges or our core certainties can be components of our epistemic perspectives. To kind of show in a little bit more detail just how epistemic perspectives could vary across individuals and how that can lead to shaping how individuals engage with evidence. We could consider, for instance, how one's religious commitments might inform the way you interact with evidence. For instance, with a particular religious commitment might come a disposition to take a sacred text as a source of knowledge, for instance. Or you might think that something like a feminist perspective would include a disposition to interpret certain patterns of behavior as evidence of sexual harassment. And so somebody who lacked that perspective might not be able to interpret that behavior in that same way, right? And so these are ways that our epistemic perspectives can lead us to engage with evidence. Okay. So having discussed some of the basics of the approach I want to take in hinge epistemology, now I want to say something about where that leaves us with problems of certainty in public life. Okay. So first I want to sketch out a little bit more just what the problem is as I understand it. So when I'm talking about public discourse, I'm going to be using a sort of a framework kind of building on John Rawls, but I'm going to be pretty skeptical of some of Rawls's overall picture, in case you're familiar with that. Um, but I'm going to be thinking of public discourse as a space of reasons. So it's going to be a realm open to the public where, say, government officials, representatives, and members of the public can exchange reasons on political, moral, and other topics of public interest. And in the book, I want to explore these two norms that I'm identifying here in public discourse. So these are ways that I suspect we expect each other to behave when we're having public discourse. The first is a norm of common reason, which says that the reasons we offer in public discourse should, in principle, be acceptable to all. And I think this connects to questions about the political justification for certain policy actions. That if you want to justify why, say, we're implementing a certain policy, it's important to have a justification which could be acceptable to anybody, right? So that they could, that's part of its legitimacy, you might think. I also identify what I'm thinking of as a norm of good faith argument, which I'm curious if you have thoughts about this. But this norm says that it is preferable that participants in public discourse provide their own reasons for a position, right? And so the idea here is that you should provide your own reason, that is the reason which explains why you hold a view, as opposed to providing just a reason that somebody could hold, but that you don't hold for that view. And I think this norm is important because it is a way of ensuring a kind of authenticity or genuineness in your participation. So the worry is that if you don't provide your own reasons for a position, then if somebody were to undermine the reasons you provided, if they were to give you a really good counter argument, that would not necessarily change your view. After all, that wasn't your real reason for holding that view in the first place. And so that means that your view is not really responsive to the reasons that you gave. And I think that can lead to an impression that you're not a good faith participant in the project of giving and asking for reasons. Okay. Now, I think I'll wrap up here in the next 10 or 15 minutes. Okay. Bringing this together, I want to focus on deep disagreement as kind of a central problem of public discourse that we could address. So deep disagreement, such as the kind that I described between Alex and Billy at the start of the talk, can be characterized as a genuine disagreement. That is, there is something which one person might think is true and another person thinks is false or not true, or at least that we can't know it. And it's a disagreement which is persistent, systematic, and involves a lack of shared background between the parties. And this is a way of defining what a deep disagreement is. In the literature, there are a couple of different approaches you could take to deep disagreement. Pessimistic accounts essentially argue that deep disagreements cannot be directly rationally resolved, which is to say that even after everybody has offered their genuine reasons for their views and those have been considered, it doesn't end up changing people's minds, right? So you don't come to an agreement at the end. By contrast, optimistic accounts maintain that a rational resolution to a disagreement is always in principle possible, either directly or maybe just indirectly. So this is I say it's optimistic because it's the hope that eventually, if you provide the right reasons, it could lead people to come to a consensus and resolve the disagreement. Good. Now, when we're talking about a deep disagreement, it's kind of hard to say whether the disagreement is or is not really truly rationally resolvable. But I think that when we consider real world cases and also some hypothetical cases, it seems to me that it's plausible to think that at least some disagreements are not really rationally resolvable, not in a direct way. So, for instance, this is because not all apparent resolutions are truly rational in practice. So sometimes people might come to an agreement, but it might just be because one person has decided that they just want to concede to the other person, maybe for the sake of preserving a friendship or a good working relationship. So they'll just say, okay, all right, I'll agree with you, even though they don't really fully accept the view that they're agreeing with. Another consideration here is that it's possible to generate some idealizations under which a disagreement could be resolved. So you might hypothetically suppose, well, if the other person only saw this piece of evidence, or if the other person only responded to this evidence in a rational way, then that would resolve the disagreement. But I'm a little bit wary of this approach because I think those kinds of idealizations, those hypothetical cases, they seem to me to manifest already an overly optimistic approach to rationality, which is not what we get when we think about the insights of hinge epistemology. Overall, I think the motivation for some of these more optimistic approaches is rather to avoid some of the anticipated consequences of rational irresolvability, namely that it seems like that could lead to a sort of epistemic relativism. And so I think there's a prior opposition to epistemic relativism, which then leads theorists not to want to allow for genuine rational irresolvability, because rational irresolvability might seem like it entails relativism. Okay. Good. So finally starting to wrap up here, I want to talk next about the hinge account of deep disagreement. And so using hinge epistemology is now a rather mainstream way of trying to explain deep disagreement. And so according to the hinge approach, the basic idea is that deep disagreement is a disagreement which results from a conflict in the hinges of the people who are in disagreement. So it happens when I hold something as a core certainty, which you maybe don't hold as a core certainty, and that can lead to a disagreement. And when that happens, the disagreement will be persistent because the hinges are not directly rationally responsive. So if you try to offer a reason for me to reject my hinge certainty, that reason will appear less certain to me than the thing it is supposed to make me reject. And so that makes it hard for me to take the reason you're offering as genuine evidence to change my view. And so that contributes to the persistence of the disagreement. The disagreements are also systematic because hinges, on my view, inform how epistemic agents interact with evidence in general. And so if you disagree about one hinge, that's likely to bleed over into many other disagreements. Furthermore, a hinge disagreement is going to involve a lack of a shared background because those hinges are associated with different epistemic perspectives. And then finally, assuming a propositional account of hinges, hinge disagreement looks like it can be genuine. There is something there is some proposition that we disagree about that one person can say is true and another person maybe says is not true. So this hinge account of deep disagreement is popular in the literature, and I think it's quite an attractive explanation. But I think we should pay attention to what a hinge has to be like in order for us to get this explanation. And so the three things I want to point out here is that hinges then should be propositional. It should be possible for hinges to vary across the parties that might disagree, because that's what the disagreement will consist in. And the hinges should be resistant to change in light of the reasons offered by the different parties, because that explains the persistence of the disagreement. The issue is that some of the other major accounts of hinge epistemology don't seem really to allow for this in the end, even though they might want to. So, of course, on non-propositional views, there's a lost disagreement, right? If a hinge is not something that can be true or false, then it's not something that you can, strictly speaking, disagree about either. On views that think hinges are universally shared, or these general abstract principles that everybody is committed to, there's no genuine disagreement there, right? If all or most of the hinges are shared, there's not an opportunity for people to have differing views to ground the disagreement. And then finally, if hinges are in some way revisable in light of counter evidence, then that would undermine the persistence that we see, which accompanies a lot of deep disagreements. Okay, so the perspectival approach that I've sketched here, I think, meets the criteria to really be able to explain deep disagreement. This is because it's a propositional account of hinge epistemology. It allows for a great variation in the content of hinges, and it holds that hinges are resistant to counter evidence. So this is a way that I would use PHE to explain deep disagreement. In wrapping up my talk now, I want to address a final problem. So I've just given an explanation of deep disagreement, but that explanation, you might think, leads to a really big problem. And so I want to address that in the final moments of the talk. And so the problem has to do with intellectual arrogance, which is another kind of problem of certainty. The perspectival hinge epistemology approach, it seems like it makes the problem of intellectual arrogance worse, because that the view seems to entail that it is in some way legitimate or okay to hold on to your core certainties, even in the face of disagreement, and even if other people are giving you reasons against that view. And so, from this view, you might ask, how could you fail to be dogmatic, arrogant, or closed-minded concerning your own certainties? This just seems to be making some of these problems worse. In order to respond to this, I would like to, I would like to advocate for a way in which we can actually have some intellectual humility about our core certainties. And so this gets back to the question of how we ought to relate to our own core certainties. And there's something paradoxical about this, right? When we talk about humility and intellectual humility, that seems to mean, you might think, being prepared to admit that you could be wrong, right? It seems to mean not being so certain of your views. And so you might think, how could that be possible for something with like a hinge, which is supposed to be completely certain? It just seems like it's not possible to have humility about that. I think that we can. And here's the approach that I take. First, when I'm talking about intellectual humility, I have a couple of accounts of that in my mind here. One is an account due to Whitcomb et al., who view intellectual humility as owning or taking accountability for your own cognitive limitations. I'm also thinking of Michael Lynch's view, who thinks of humility as an openness to improving your epistemic perspective by considering the evidence and experience of others. And so taking these two ideas together, I propose a way to be humble about your core certainties. And it's a kind of a higher order humility. It involves taking accountability for the rational groundless of your own hinges. So it's acknowledging that I have these certainties, and because they are certain, they are in a way rationally groundless for me. That's a way of admitting a kind of a cognitive limitation. You're saying that I don't have the ability to fully justify my views with good faith reasons. Hinged humility, I think, also involves maintaining an openness to improving your epistemic perspective by considering the experiences of others with curiosity. So you can imaginatively take up the perspective of another. You can inhabit other people's perspectives, and through that come to see some of the limitations of your own perspective. Now, I think in order to do this, you have to be able to practice a kind of self-knowledge about your hinges. So you have to be able to know, is this something that I am really certain of or not, right? Is this something that I'm so certain of that any attempt I might give to justify it is less certain than the thing I'm trying to justify? Or is this something which is I'm so certain of that no matter what argument somebody presents to me, I'm probably going to regard that argument with suspicion precisely because it is trying to undermine this thing which I hold as certain. How does this help us address the problem of deep disagreement? And I will leave us with this as the final point, right? So here's why I think this is a useful thing to have. Okay, sorry for all the text. So when we're talking about deep disagreement, we could categorize it as direct or indirect. A direct deep disagreement is a disagreement about your hinge. It's about your core certainty. An indirect deep disagreement is a disagreement about some proposition which is influenced by your hinge. But it's not about the hinge directly. Now, when it comes to indirect deep disagreement, I think when you have self-knowledge of where your hinge lies, you can set that hinge out of bounds for the purpose of your discussion. You can say, let's not discuss that, right? That's not open for deliberation. Let's instead focus on this other proposition, which I hold this proposition maybe because of my hinge, but that proposition could be revisable without undermining the hinge. And so if you know where your core certainties lay, then you can set some boundaries on the scope of deliberation to kind of set those outside of the limits. When it comes to direct deep disagreement, things are a little bit different because you can't just set those outside of bounds of our discussion. Instead, I think in the short term, you can at least acknowledge where reasons will give out, and that will allow you not to essentially spend time arguing about something that you're not really going to change your mind about, at least not within the span of a conversation. But over the long term, you can enter into a kind of open, non-argumentative communication to try to understand the perspective of the other. And through doing so, that can help to improve your own perspective. And that can ultimately perhaps lead to some kind of a resolution. Okay, thank you very much. I look forward to our discussion.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. I am holding the mic as the audience claps. Hopefully you could hear that. If you couldn't, I assure you there was, in fact, I'm certain that there was, in fact, clapping.
Thank you.
I'm happy to moderate on your behalf. I'm sure it would be hard for you to see, especially since some people are out of frame, who has questions. So does there anybody? Sure. So we'll have Ellen. You can begin. Let me just get you a microphone. Maybe I'll begin passing others around the room preemptively. Keep one around. Turn it on. Okay.
Okay, first of all, thank you so much for this fantastic topic. While listening to you, I was thinking about the situation in the US today. We talk about this extremely partisan situation, and given that you see this strong disagreement, how this strong disagreement on both, with both sides extremely undermine the political belief and action in public life. So I was wondering whether this your suggestion of hinge humility here maybe it would help somehow to resolve the issue, at least as one of the way to resolve the issue, or it's too complicated just by hinge epistemology or hinge humility. That lead to the example also you were given in the beginning of your talk, the debate between Alex and also what's the other name, Alex and Billy, about the pre-choice and the pre-choice and pro-choice and pro-life. And you ask a question whether the disagreement can be resolved through pure rational, approach. Probably absolutely no. And then you talk about this perspectival approach. So my question is that I can tell that you tried by using this perspectival approach, and that somehow both sides can loosen up a little bit of their absolute certainty. And but my question is how you make sure that this approach, or even like the hinge humility, would not fall into the trap of relativism or even skepticism in the end.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
Good. Yes, okay. Thank you very much for the question. Yeah, these topics are, of course, very much on my mind right now, right? And so this is a big motivation for this whole project in the first place. It's kind of how to address this sort of partisanship and polarization. And so really I'm picking up maybe on two questions here. So one is maybe how could this perspectival hinge epistemology and hinge humility, how could that help to address the kind of partisan nature of discourse, maybe in the US? But the other question I hear is, how do you do that without maybe moving back towards relativism or skepticism? So with regard to the first question about how to, well, yeah, sorry, let me pause for a moment, just think what I want to say. Okay, good. So I think maybe the common answer to both of these might come up in thinking through, again, the idea of a perspective. So I think the usefulness of talking about epistemic perspectives, especially if that becomes more widespread, right? If that's something that we can all kind of think about collectively, or if that becomes part of the discourse, I think the notion of perspective already encourages a kind of humility, because it is admitting essentially that you have a limited grasp on reality. And so when it comes to, say, disagreements between Alex and Billy, and similar disagreements that are happening in public discourse, if it's possible to lead people to recognize that their views are based within these perspectives, and that their perspectives can be biased, that their perspectives can filter some information, that I think already can lead to some humility, where you might say that, well, from my perspective, right, this is the view that I have, but I know that that's not the whole story about what reality is like, and that there can be some ways that goes wrong. So I would like to suggest that through thinking about our own views in terms of this perspective, that can result in some kind of humility, which can maybe help us to navigate these disagreements more skillfully, instead of attacking the other person as, well, your view is clearly wrong, or right, there's a, it's completely mistaken to think that. we might approach each other with a little bit more empathy and realizing that, well, my perspective is limited. I might not know everything. Maybe I have something to learn from you. But likewise, you could also say, well, your perspective maybe has some limits as well. Maybe you have something to learn from me. This sounds hopelessly naive as I'm saying it, but I do kind of hope for something like this. When it comes to avoiding relativism and skepticism, this, I think, also comes out from focusing on the notion of perspective, because I think, as I view it, part of the kind of idea of having a perspective is that it is a perspective on a common shared reality. And I think that's key to addressing these worries about relativism and skepticism. And so there is a danger. There is a danger, especially in the US right now, where there's a lot of discussion about maybe we're living in a post-truth kind of world at the moment. And this is, I think, maybe taking some of the relativism idea too far, right? And that's gaining some currency in how people talk about public discourse itself. So it becomes easy for somebody to say, well, I have my view, and that's kind of like, I have my view, you have your view, and we get this discussion of like alternative facts, right? It's like maybe you live in your world and I live in my world, and this really starts to sound to me like a problematic form of relativism. The way that the perspectival approach addresses that is to say, it's not going to allow for this idea of alternative facts, and it's not really in the realm of post-truth either, precisely because there has to be this commitment to a shared reality that we have a perspective on. And so it can't be the case that just anything goes, right? That the perspective has to be answerable to the common reality that we share. I hope that's addressing your question. I'm really relying here on one of my former teachers, Michael Lynch, who very much argues for the need for us as in general, that we need to really reinforce this idea of a common shared reality that we live in together.
That's from Sue Rays.
So I kind of know what you're talking about. So first, hinge is kind of innate property, and there exists a kind of state that this kind of property can be denied. So it generates a kind of hinge humility that some of the deep disagreement can be resolved. My question actually lies on the second step, which is some denies, if my hinge was denied or it is denied, it does not necessarily generate a kind of status that is called hinge humility. I can be denied, but there's still some distance to the hinge humility. So my question is, how the hinge humility can be generated or self-generated?
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Oh, yeah. So if I'm understanding correctly, it sounds like you're discussing a situation. Let's say I have a hinge commitment, and somebody denies the hinge commitment. They say that's wrong. And my reaction to that is not a reaction of humility, but my reaction is maybe something more like just reaffirming, I don't know. No, of course I'm right. Or maybe I get angry, right? I'm upset that you would even challenge something like this, right? Certainly this happens. And so then the question becomes, so maybe how do we encourage a response of humility instead of a response of maybe arrogance or just dogmatism?
Yes.
I wish I had a good answer for you. Yes, this is something that I would hope to explore in the book more. I think what I can say is that to a certain extent, you can't exactly force somebody to go somewhere they don't want to go. So if somebody is really insistent that, no, this I will not show this humility about, like, this I'm just going to hold on to and maybe react with some anger, I don't think there is much that you could do to talk a person out of that. So instead, what I would want to do in the book is really focus on a concept of maturity. So if you want to be a mature person in how you relate to your core certainties, what does that look like? And my understanding is that this kind of maturity it involves in part being okay with or being accepting of challenges, right? That you might come across things which challenge that which you hold certain. And so I think when something challenges your core certainties, that can be upsetting. And I suppose that part of the reason why that's upsetting is that it's kind of undermining your sense of security and certainty in the world. And so that can feel threatening. So in this line, I might suggest that a more mature way to approach these things is to realize that not all challenges are, not all real challenges to your view are a cause for insecurity, right? That you can live in a place where you see, oh, my view is challenged. This is a little bit upsetting, right? Because this is kind of how I make my way through the world, is by having this kind of certainty. But being able to just acknowledge that and move towards being more open to considering those challenges. I'm sorry if that's not a very satisfying response right now. I'm thinking a little bit about Hans Gadamer here, so thinking about hermeneutics a little bit. So Gadamer has this idea that about what is a mature sort of the reaction of a mature person in a hermeneutic sphere. So maybe that's of some help. But thank you for the question.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you for the presentation. So I have a question is like, it is a necessary condition of being the epistemic agent to like have hinges. So I have this question because I recently read an article named Perspectives and Friends in Pursuit Ultimate Understanding. And in this paper, the author argues that even in an ideal situation, we have the ultimate understanding of something. We need perspectives. And as you mentioned, the perspectives relates to, hinges. And so I think like in such an ideal situation, it seems like we still need hinges. And the interesting thing is, if we adopt the propositional readings of hinges, that means even in such ideal situation, we have the ultimate understanding. There are still some propositions we cannot deny. So yes, that's my questions.
Yes, thank you. Good, yeah. So yes, it's right. On the view that I'm developing, I do see it as a necessary condition that any epistemic agent would have to have some hinges. And maybe it would help if I explain a little bit why I think that. And yes, I know the paper, yeah, the Perspectives and Frames in Pursuit of Ultimate Understanding. That's where I'm getting a lot of, that's Elizabeth Camp. And that's where I'm getting some of my ideas about the notion of perspective as well. And right, so Camp in the end, at the end of that paper is talking about this kind of ideal situation, epistemically, that is. And yes, is suggesting that even when you have access to all the information, right, even when you have everything that you could want as an epistemic agent, Camp's argument is that you still can't do away with perspectives. And so I kind of see this as a way of saying that you can't really be an epistemic agent. And so you can't really have a view about the world without having a perspective. That would be a view that I endorse. And you're also right that because I'm thinking of this through hinge epistemology, for me, that means that you can't really be an epistemic agent without having some hinges. Just to make a brief point of connection to public discourse a little bit, I think what this might mean for public discourse is that, you know, if somebody were to say that, oh, all of my beliefs are well justified, or if somebody were to say that I have good reasons for everything that I say, and I can give you my reasons, and explain and justify everything that I've provided to you, I think there's very much a temptation to say that kind of thing, and I think we might like to think that about ourselves, but I don't think that could be true. And it absolutely connects up to this point, because I think part of being an epistemic agent is that you have to have some hinges, and those are going to be things that you can't provide a rational basis for. And so it's almost a mark of intellectual arrogance to say in the first place that I could have a justification for everything I believe. So another way to kind of exhibit a form of humility would be to say that I can't is just to admit the truth and say I can't justify everything that I believe. Now, why must it be the case that every epistemic agent has hinges? I've been developing an argument for this view. I will try to present a condensed version of that here. So bear with me for a moment if that's okay. Because yeah, you could ask why should an agent have why should it be necessary that an agent has hinges? So the basic idea here is that all sort of justification for belief kind of picking up on some of the claims that Wittgenstein makes in Uncertainty, and this has been discussed somewhat in the literature as well. There's this idea of a rational grounding principle. So I think Duncan Pritchard has suggested it. Matt Jope has raised some objections to it. In response to that, Pritchard has said he doesn't actually endorse it. He just thinks it's how we should interpret Wittgenstein. But it's a principle that seems like a good principle to me. And so the principle says that in order to have a rational grounds for a belief or to have a rational grounds for a doubt, the grounds should initially be more certain than the thing they are supposed to be grounds for. So to try to put that maybe in a slightly different way, right? If I'm going to form a belief in something, then my reason for coming to have that belief should be a more certain basis for me than the belief is itself until I come to have it. So the idea is you work from what you're more certain about, and you use that to extrapolate your knowledge and come to have new knowledge that initially you might not be sure about until you reason through it. Given this principle, this rational grounding principle, the next point is to notice. So let's say I have this, I want to ground this claim P, so I have some more certain thing Q, and I'm using Q to provide a rational basis for P. Well, I'm going to have something more certain than Q, which then grounds Q. So let's say R R grounds Q and S grounds R. As you kind of have this chain of justifications, which leads to some of the more classical forms of skepticism when you notice, like, where does that chain of justifications end? The idea that I have here is that while the chain of justifications is going to end in the thing that you're most certain of. So of all the things that you accept or believe, the thing you're most certain of, you can't ground it any further, because anything, there couldn't be anything more certain to you than the thing which you're already most certain of. And so that thing that you're most certain of plays this kind of core role within your epistemic system. And so that's going to be the hinge, and that's going to be the thing that can't be grounded further. Why does this mean epistemic agents have to have hinges? Well, notice that the explanation I'm giving is an explanation about how you rationally ground a belief. And so if the rational grounds for all beliefs requires that you have more certain grounds for those grounds, then in order to have a rational basis for belief at all, maybe that is to say, in order to be an epistemic agent, you have to have something that you are most certain of, and the thing which you are most certain of is going to be a hinge. So this just means that basically to have a rationally grounded belief at all requires that you have some hinge or other. I hope that was clear enough. But yeah, thank you. I'm working through this argument now.
Thank you very much. Very interesting talk, and I think your book project is very much needed because we are surrounded by disagreement in the public discourse. I have a question that is like probably a very general one about the very nature of hinges for, like, at least for what you propose to be like a good account of the nature of hinges. That is, so if I understand correctly, you take hinges to be propositional, right? Correct, yeah. So my question is perhaps related to whether there is anything special more than just a proposition about the hinges. And I'm asking this question because it seems to me that in the public discourse, disagreements sometimes are perhaps more often are about just propositions expressed by empirical statements. For example, whether climate change is anthropogenic versus natural. It seems to me there is nothing so special about these, this disagreement that would really require, at least prima facie, right, recurs to hinges, if hinges are just propositional in nature, right? Probably this kind of disagreement could be addressed relying on the value of certainty, perhaps within the dominant view of certainty in the West, based on empirical studies and data. And of course, these may be related to hinges, of course, sure. But yeah, so that's my question. It's about the nature of hinges and whether we need to make a kind of a hierarchy there if we take hinges to be propositional, and whether we are allowed, given the propositional nature of hinges from your proposal, to treat all disagreement as the same, having the same root.
Good. Oh, okay. Yes. Okay. Thank you for that. So that's right. In the account that I'm proposing, right, I am maintaining that hinges are propositions. But I think you're pushing me in a good direction here, because your question is making me see that maybe I shouldn't say that they are just propositions, right? That's the end of the story. I think they need to have a propositional, they kind of have to have a propositional guise. You know, they have to be propositions, as I see it, really, in order for us to have disagreement at all. right? So I think that's part of the issue. If you don't think they're propositions, because then how do we disagree about them? There would be nothing that you say is true that I could say is false. But just because they're propositions doesn't mean that they don't extend beyond that. And so, for instance, I'm actually quite sympathetic with a lot of what Danielle Moyle-Sharrock says. And so she, of course, advances a non-propositional view where hinges are kind of embodied in these like ways of acting, right? And so I think that has a really good basis as a reading of Wittgenstein and as an approach to epistemology. I think we need them to be propositional to get the disagreement. But as I like to think of it, the proposition is kind of the how to put this? The propositional part of it is how the hinge is dressed up, if that makes sense, right? It kind of wears a proposition as its clothes. So the proposition is sort of the way that this commitment becomes codified or manifested. But underneath that, I think there's a lot more in terms of these like ways of life. Yes, and I think you're also pointing in a really good direction here when it comes to certain disagreements, say like a disagreement about climate change, which seems like the kind of thing that we should be able to resolve just by pointing to the evidence and pointing to the empirical facts. And so it can almost seem kind of like surprising that, like, why haven't we figured this out yet? And it seems to me that, yeah, part of the answer to that is that we're not simply talking about these as propositions, right? Because if these were just propositional attitudes, they should be responsive to that kind of evidence. Yeah, so I think it's right that there's more to the story. There's more going on in that situation, where maybe you can say something like, if somebody believes that there is no such thing as human-caused climate change, they're stating this as a proposition, but maybe the attitude that they're really expressing is one of a more kind of discontent with what they see as the academic elites or something like this. I'm kind of making that up a little bit, but I think you can kind of see like there's a more general attitude underlying why they have that particular view or that particular belief.
Thank you very much. Just a very brief follow-up as to, so would it be correct then in your account from your project to say that I mean, at least one hypothesis about this propositional view of hinges, can it be that then these hinges in your account can be also regarded as having some kind of a psychological certainty, such a kind of a property that is, however, like psychological or phenomenological, like the way this propositional content seems like very certain to the subject, and if so, can actually public discourse be the factory of hinges? Like, what is the etiology of hinges, if that is the case?
Those are some really good ideas. I like that quite a lot. Yes. Yeah. Sorry, I got caught up with you talking about the etiology of hinges and how maybe they could be manufactured by public discourse, which that strikes me like that seems like a really interesting, important idea. I think I agree. But I got caught up with that and I missed the first part of your question. I'm sorry.
No, I was just thinking that maybe there is something phenomenological about these hinges that makes them feel very certain to the subject. Yeah, so I was wondering whether like public discourse may be the factory of this, like the manufacturing hinges in the public sphere, right? In this shared reality.
Yes, very good. Thank you. Yes, so I would agree with your construal that as I'm portraying these hinges, there is a component of this kind of psychological certainty. And I think that's a little bit at odds with how some other people have discussed hinges in the literature. So this is one way that I'm taking a different path, where I think there can be a tendency to think in terms of kind of objective certainty, which would be more of a feature, say, of the propositions or just a matter of the evidence. But I think I'm interested in this more subjective kind of psychological certainty. Yes, and so that can have a phenomenology to it. However, one thing that I might caution, because I don't think it's simply a matter of that phenomenological psychological certainty. And the reason for that is I think it's possible to be mistaken about what your own hinges are, or to be in some kind of bad faith or denial about what your real hinges are. And so that means that it's not always going to jump out to you that like, oh, this is something that I hold to in this hinge way, even though it might explain a lot about how you engage with evidence in general. And so it can seem like it's a part of your epistemic perspective.
Judging by the time, I don't think we have enough time left to go around another question and answer. So I am going to cut things here as far as Q&A is concerned, with apologies to those in the queue who did not have a chance to ask a question, though perhaps you could try to get in touch with Dr. Johnson yourself and continue the conversation
Yes.
through other means. With that being said, I would be very appreciative if you all joined me one more time in giving our speaker a round of applause and thanking him for his presentation.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. Really appreciate it. And I suppose your day is only just beginning.
Now I can go to work. Yes.
Now you could go to. Oh, oof. Wow. What a way to start. Really, we do appreciate that a lot. Thanks so much. And I'll be in touch.
Okay. Yes. Thank you all for the great discussion. This was really useful. Okay. Thank you. Oh.